Okay, so this person we're about to interview, his name is Gabriel Acevero. He is a Maryland legislator. He's extremely progressive. He has been championing something called Anton's Law that is trying to bring some transparency to Maryland's policing after the death of Anton Black, which is one of the many different examples of a black man being killed by police. And he wants the idea of people being able. Well, basically, he'll explain it when he gets here. But the idea is more transparency when it comes to policing. I'm really excited to interview him. Seems like a wonderful individual. Again, he's somebody I actually looked up to when I was, when I was like, working in the Maryland General Assembly. So it's really cool that I get to interview him now. Police reform, that's exactly what we're talking about. We're just waiting. Oh, here it is. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. How you doing, man?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm doing a-okay. I'm doing a-okay. How was your long meeting?
It was pretty good. Pretty informative. Great discussion. So yeah.
That's good to hear. That's good to hear. So, would you like to introduce yourself? We are currently live. Just wanted to give you the heads up.
Right. Well, I am Gabriel Acevero. I am the state delegate for Maryland's 39th district in Montgomery County, and I serve on the House Appropriations Committee in the Maryland General Assembly.
Awesome. I'm happy to have you on. It's actually funny, cause I was actually a page. I think it was not this session, but the one before that. I was a page in the Maryland General Assembly, and you were one of the few people I wrote down beforehand I wanted to go meet. And while you weren't there, I did get to meet with your staff, and I actually talked about this topic, Anton's Law, like basically last year. So it's weird how this all has come full circle.
Yeah. It's a lot of work that we've been doing around police transparency and accountability. My first legislative session, and just really excited to be on the House Police Accountability Work Group, and really excited about the recommendations and comprehensive legislation that I'm hoping we are going to put forth.
Okay. Okay. So I'm just gonna start it off. What is this legislation? What is Anton's Law?
So Anton's Law is named after Anton Black, a 19-year-old college athlete and expectant father who died in police custody, and the officer that was responsible for his death had a terrible service record in Delaware. In fact, he was known because he was indicted in Delaware on second-degree assault charges for after footage showing him kicking an unarmed, subdued black man in the head. And so the community sort of came out, and they were rightfully so upset about the video that had surfaced, that charges were brought and later dismissed. And I'm hoping we could discuss a little bit more why those charges were dismissed, and the national prosecution rate and successful prosecution rate of law enforcement officers. But the charges were dismissed. He was not decertified as an officer, and that's also an important part of this conversation. But he was not decertified as a law enforcement officer. So he was given a pretty hefty severance package, and he moved to Maryland. And he was hired by the Greensboro Police Department, despite folks in the town urging the town officials not to hire him because of his record in Delaware. He was hired nonetheless, and not too long after he was hired in 2018, he chased down, tasered, hogtied him and I think it was about two or three more officers who were off duty, that chased down Anton to his parents' home, where they tasered him. They were in essence hog tying him and trying to, I guess, subdue him or arrest him. And at that point, he kept telling his parents that he couldn't breathe and that he loved his mother, and he became unresponsive. And so the entire incident obviously sparked protests, not only because of Webster's history in Delaware, but because this is a small knit town, and a lot of the folks in town had urged the town officials not to hire Webster because of this very concern. And here we are in a situation like this. And so some town officials attempted to cover up the investigation around Anton Black's death. The former chief of police for Greensboro was indicted on misconduct charges for the role that he played in hiding multiple use of force reports from Webster's application when he was hired. And so we saw many ways in which the system not only protected Webster, but ensured that any kind of an oversight, any kind of a transparency, and any kind of accountability around Anton's Black death would be quelled. And so I started working with the Coalition for Justice for Anton Black on legislation that addresses some of the concerns that the family and the community, and really that a lot of other communities across this country have been calling for, and that is transparency and accountability in the way that public safety is administered in their communities, who is held accountable, what kind of an oversight. And so we introduced Anton's Law in the 2019 session, and I reintroduced it in the 2020 session because it did not make it out of committee, and it did not make it out of committee in the 2020 session. But the bill would, if passed, would accomplish three things. One is ensuring that a complainant receives a copy of the investigative file once an investigation is concluded, as well as any prior complaints against a police officer. And we know that is important because, as we saw in Anton Black's case, as well as in George Floyd's case, you have officers with multiple use of force, multiple misconduct or use of force complaints, and those have not been properly addressed internally because police investigate themselves. And so as a result, we see more and more law enforcement investigating themselves, a lack of transparency and accountability. And what that means is a lack of justice for the victims and their families. And so Anton's Law would address the MPIA, the Maryland Public Information Act, in terms of the sharing of information, what the public could request, what it can receive. But it also deals with the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, which is a really important discussion around police violence and accountability. The Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights is a law that grants special privileges, not rights, to law enforcement officers that ordinary citizens like you and I do not have. So in essence, it obviously protects them in terms of transparency and information sharing. It protects them in terms of investigations, because within the LEOBR, it says only a sworn officer can interrogate or investigate another sworn officer. So this is how we find police and sheriff departments investigating themselves and having internal affairs, right? Because in state law, it's codified that practice. So when you look at civilian review boards like the one in Baltimore City, they are in essence weak because of these kinds of laws that would otherwise be powers that civilians or the public would have, right? In terms of oversight, in terms of information, in terms of even subpoena power and disciplinary powers. So Anton's Law, provision of that would repeal that part of the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights that says only a law enforcement officer can investigate and interrogate another law enforcement officer. So what that would do is empower civilian review boards and local jurisdictions to pass legislation creating civilian review boards. And then lastly, Anton's Law establishes a use of force standard statewide. And so it's three components that addresses many of the concerns that our communities have raised over the years around policing and racist policing. But I think there are other elements to this conversation that we need to be talking about, such as the presence of white supremacy or white nationalism within police departments. We need to talk about the decertification of corrupt and racist cops so that they're not going 2 towns over or to another state and then getting hired. We need to talk about the role of a special prosecutor or a state agency taking on these investigations and prosecutions. So we're taking it away from states and district attorneys, because as we know, states and district attorneys who we elect work very closely with law enforcement. And oftentimes that presents a conflict of interest, and they aren't able to do their prosecutorial duties in terms of bringing charges in cases where it is needed, whether we see that in the case of Ahmaud Arbery or in the case of Breonna Taylor, who it's been over 3 months since she was killed by 3 Louisville police officers in her home, and no charges have been brought. And that is the responsibility of prosecutors. So there are so many elements to this conversation that we need to discuss. And so Anton's Law, in essence, while it is the most expansive legislation introduced in the General Assembly around police accountability, there's so much more that we need to do and we need to include in this conversation around ending police violence.
So there's a lot to dissect there. So I just want to start on the beginning of what you talked about. So this was an individual with a extremely poor record on being abusive towards people in Delaware, yet he was able to basically come over here, become an officer in Maryland with basically no problem and no notification really to the community. But they do find out eventually, and they try to stop it, but it doesn't. They're unable to. Why is it that someone with such a poor record was able to just become a cop in Maryland so easily?
Well, simply put, as I write in my op-ed, which I put out today, that I encourage folks to read and to then.
Oh, it was quite good.
I'm sorry?
Reddit is quite good.
Thank you. I certainly encourage folks to not just read, but to take action by calling your state delegates, calling your state senator, and also calling on your governor to take action, because state legislatures are in the driver's seat of the issue on ending police violence. And so what we need is more state legislatures acting the way we saw with the New York State Assembly when they convened a special session and passed not just the Eric Garner chokehold bill, but repealing a law that shielded police misconduct records, as well as a number of other things. And so state legislatures are in the driver's seat of this issue. And a lot of our efforts, need to be focused at the state level. There are things that we could do at the federal and at the local level, absolutely. But a lot of this is governed by state legislatures. And so that's where our efforts should be. And so in the article in my piece, which I encourage folks to take a read, I not only talk about Anton's Law as explained, but I also talk about the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights and why it's important for us as a legislature to repeal, and us as activists and people who are both impacted and people who are non-Black. I hate to use the word allies, because I'm not really seeking allies in this fight, but co-conspirators. And so all those folks who are non-Black and stand in solidarity with us should also be calling for the repeal of the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, as well as the passage of Anton's Law. And so in the piece, I sort of discussed that and what it is that we need to do and where we are today. And so we just have to continue to keep up this pressure and understand that we need a commitment, not just to the moment, but to the movement for all Black lives.
So when it comes to the issue of the law enforcement's officers' Bill of Rights, there's one thing that continually comes up when it comes to police reform and trying to get all of this through. the police union and the strength of the police union when it comes to dictating how officers conduct themselves in this country. How do you target something like the Law Officers Bill of Rights when you have such a powerful institution that is propped up itself for decades, like the police union? How do you take on the police union?
Well, I think there's a lot of things at play here. One is people need to be more engaged and politically educated on this issue. Not a lot of people are aware, and I talk about this in my article, when pain is the prerequisite for progress. I talk about how Maryland was the first state to pass a law enforcement officer's Bill of Rights, in essence, granting these special privileges, not rights, to law enforcement officers that also protect corrupt and racist cops. And so, if we are truly committed to ending police violence, we must be committed to dismantling the policies that perpetuate police violence, and the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights is one of those. And I think it's also a question about endorsements and the amount of money that some state legislators and federal legislators and local legislators receive from the Fraternal Order of Police, those that gleefully accept their endorsement. I think it's a deep conversation that people need to be having with their state delegates and state senators about why it is that they are so proud to have the endorsement and accept the money of an organization that is not only anti-Black in terms of the work that they do, but has fought every effort to bring about police transparency and accountability. So that's the real question.
If they ever came up to you, would you take their endorsement?
Well, when I ran in 2018, I did not. I refused their endorsement, and I did not take any PAC money from the FOP or from corporations, because my values do not align with those organizations or institutions. And so I refused the endorsement of the Fraternal Order of Police because of a number of reasons, but one of which, when I was, and I still am, a Black Lives Matter activist in 2015, we saw the response of the various Fraternal Order of Police lodges, whether it's in Baltimore City or the ones across the country from Ferguson to Chicago and other places, where they were not just demonizing activists and organizers as sort of thugs and encouraging further violence against peaceful protesters, but they have also actively worked to stop or stymie legislation around police transparency and accountability. And I think when you think of all of that, as well as other things in its totality, folks should be really asking why it is their state delegates and state senators are soliciting, are accepting not just the endorsement, but funds from organizations like the Fraternal Order of Police and other police associations. That's the work that folks need to do. In terms of what we can do in the state legislature, the Maryland General Assembly, like any other space of power, runs on political will. And when political will is not there to get something done, the will of the people must be present, as we've seen historically. And so I think the will of the people is much greater, and has certainly, as we've seen throughout history, been a force for change. And we need to ensure, as I said earlier, we're making a commitment to the movement and not the moment, right? When all the cameras have left and people have gone back to their homes, will folks show up, and will they continue to fight and to disrupt? Because that's when it matters. And so we need to show up in Annapolis and in state capitals across this country to ensure that we're keeping up that pressure, so that there is political will to get the necessary and comprehensive legislation done. And then lastly, we need to ensure that we're then calling on our governor to support and enact legislation that is passed. But there's a role for everyone to play. But there is not a singular or easy answer on how to take on the Fraternal Order of Police on this issue. I think it's a myriad of things that we need to do. But folks need to certainly be educated on why it is we're calling for the repeal of the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, why it is so necessary for Anton's Law to be passed. And once folks have done that, it obviously makes them better advocates when speaking with their state delegates and state senators, and pushing them on that legislation, right? And then we will do our job, folks like Senator Jill P. Carter and myself and Delegate Eric Barron from Prince George's County and so many others. We will continue to do what we can in our capacity. But folks have the organizers and the activists have to be out front in these state capitals making that push as well.
Now we are unique in the fact that we are a blue state with a Republican governor, one that has a different view of policing in this country than we do. Somebody who I don't believe you're in favor of mandatory minimum sentencing, but he is, and he's been pushing it hard for a while. He probably has a very different view of how policing in this country should be done. How are you going to confront a governor on this issue? Like you've given some like examples of how we can get out into the streets and get out to the capitals, get to our representatives, but what kind of fight can we expect from a governor who is pushing mandatory minimum sentencings when we're pushing for police reform?
So I think it's about priorities. We have seen the state legislature not just pass bills, but also override the governor's vetoes. And so we have to ensure that we're doing what we can in our capacity as state legislators to pass the necessary legislation. And if Governor Hogan then vetoes that legislation, he is accountable to Black and brown communities, to poor white communities that are the victims of police violence. He is accountable to Indigenous communities here in Maryland. He's responsible. He's accountable to the LGBTQ plus community, which historically have been the recipients of police violence. In fact, we wouldn't have an LGBTQ movement if it weren't for queer and trans people of color fighting the police and brutality, right? So he would certainly be showing his true self, but that in no way means that we should not be doing what we can in our capacity as state legislators to pass the necessary legislation, right? And then we would ask folks to keep up the pressure, obviously, on him. But if he vetoes it, then the General Assembly needs to do what it has done on important legislation that the governor has vetoed in the past, such as the Blueprint for Maryland's Future, which we obviously plan on overturning, the HBCU veto, we plan on overturning that as well. If we can do that for these very important issues, and they are certainly important as well as other issues, then we can do that when it comes to repealing the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, when it comes to passing Anton's Law.
I remember sitting there when Jill Carter and Mary Washington were in the Senate fighting against a private police force being formed around Johns Hopkins University and having my soul crushed as people basically laughed at them while they were the only people standing up against that. How far has the conversation shifted, and has it been positive towards the passage of Anton's Law since we had things go through like that?
Well, I obviously think the political will is there, obviously now because of the national discourse around police violence and Black Lives Matter. But I think at the end of the day, nothing good comes out of state capitals and in Congress and in spaces of power until good people organize, strategize, and mobilize and educate folks, because we can't organize people if the people aren't educated, not just on the issue, but what our ask and what our demands are. And so we need to continue doing that. I think regardless of the political climate, whether it's a Republican governor and Republican state legislature, or a Democratic state legislature and a Democratic governor, because we've had those in the past. In fact, we've had those more times in history than we've had Republican governors and Democratic state legislatures, and action was not taken. So this is not about trying to find the right political climate, but more so about are we going to organize as oppressed people to ensure that we're dismantling the systems and the policies that dehumanize us, regardless of who is in power.
So if we get back specifically to Anton's Law, we would be able. You've said this is three-pronged. Number one, we would be able to look at the record of police officers after they've been involved in incidents, where somebody has died, right? Or is it any police officer involved shooting?
So there's it's not to get really granular with it. It's not just about officer shootings. This is about a complainant asking for information when they have had interactions with law enforcement, right? We want to ensure that there is transparency, that if we as complainants, whether it's use of excessive force, whether it's use of deadly force, whether it's threat of use of deadly force and the way officers conduct themselves, complainants should have a copy of the investigative file. And if in cases of use of force, that if this person have had prior use of force complaints, that is something that is certainly pertinent information that should be shared, because that is how we not only help identify problem officers, but that's how we build trust. People can't trust investigations if you don't believe there is proper openness and transparency, right? People trust somewhat elected officials because they know what it is that we're doing, right? Our voting records, our floor proceedings, right? The bills we introduce, how much money we get in contributions from various organizations, individuals, PACs, etc. And we should be comfortable with the idea, or more comfortable with the idea, of radical transparency when it comes to the way police and law enforcement do their job.
So I have an incident with a police officer, and I believe they've acted inappropriate in some manner. I file a request. What happens?
You file a request for
to look at the record of this officer, see if there's been any prior incidents of a similar thing. Isn't this?
So if you were to request it, similar to the way under the Maryland Public Information Act, the way you request other information, then that agency or organization is responsible to provide you with that information within a timely manner. And so the idea behind this, and the reason why we're looking at the MPIA, is because part of the issue around Anton Black's death was the lack of transparency and information sharing. Not only was the town officials hiding and covering up information in the investigation, but the family was not receiving any information despite calls, despite demands, and despite protests by the Coalition for Justice for Anton Black. And so again,
they were covering it up. You've said this a few times,
right.
But can you go into specifics on how they covered it up?
So I can't obviously talk about specific instances, but one of the complaints that the Coalition for Justice for Anton Black filed with the state was in essence against the town officials for basically shutting down debate, because the coalition was showing up to a number of these town meetings and requesting information, signing up to testify, was following up on information. And not only were they not receiving it, but they were shutting down debate in terms of changing the rules, in terms of public testimony and public input, clearly trying to deal with the multiple demands that they were getting from the coalition for information. And so they were not only doing that, but they were also when folks had asked whether Webster was off of the force, whether he's still on, that was information they couldn't provide. He was still on the force at the time, and it was only after increased pressure and the governor saying that Anton Black's family deserved answers and accountability, which they later got, right? And it should not take an elected official or a governor, for that matter, calling for transparency in order for it to happen. That needs to be standard. So if Dylan had an interaction with law enforcement where excessive force was used, and you filed a complaint, right? Not only about use of excessive force, you should get a copy of the investigative file once that investigation has concluded. In addition to that, if you were to request prior complaints against a particular officer, because you may end up finding out that you're not the only person that has had issues with this officer, that's pertinent information, right? And so all of those things should be made public. We saw in New York, the state assembly repealed, I believe it was 50A, that prevented police misconduct records from being public. Now that will be public with the Governor Cuomo signing those legislation and others into law, right? So we have to get into that. I'm more comfortable with the idea of radical transparency, that people should be able to get information on whether it's a complaint or how police are operating in our communities.
I've put your article in the chat, and if anybody wants to read it, it is in the chat for you to click. It is titled, it is from Maryland Matters, When Pain is the Prerequisite for Progress. I do recommend everybody not only go read it, but share it. Now, there's the transparency part is probably the part that's talked about the most when it comes to Anton's Law, at least when my interactions with it. But there's two other parts which you brought up, which are also important. One of them has to do with basically a civilian review board. Am I correct? You brought that up earlier?
That's correct. So as of right now, police and sheriff's departments, they investigate themselves. So in essence, police officers investigating, and in most instances, exonerating other police officers for alleged misconduct.
Love
Right?
if I could do that. I love. Hey, you were speeding. Nope, I checked. I wasn't. I'd love if I could do that.
Right. And so because of state law, particularly the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, that in essence says only a sworn officer can interrogate and investigate another sworn officer, the role that civilian review boards would otherwise serve, which is as having investigative powers or oversight, right? And you see in some cases, some civilian review boards having subpoena powers. That cannot happen because of that provision of the LEOBR. Baltimore City has a civilian review board that really cannot do too much because of existing law. And so a piece of Anton's Law would repeal that provision of the LEOBR that says only a sworn officer can investigate, interrogate another sworn officer. And what that would do is help empower civilian review boards in being able to then take on that role and looking into situations or investigating situations of alleged misconduct.
So a civilian review board finds there's been misconduct. What does that board do from there?
Well, that all depends on the powers that board have. Various boards have various powers, and some boards have no powers. Some boards are pretty much just window dressing, so to speak. And some have subpoena powers. Some have investigative powers to be able to request information, look into, have a final decision in terms of disciplinary action or terminations. And so the only way we can empower those civilian review boards is by removing that provision, so they would then have greater responsibility, and civilians or the public would then have greater power over the way investigations are done and what kind of an information is provided, and who can request what, right? So that's a pretty important part of the conversation. And then, of course, use of force. Um, in the case of Anton Black, the use of force certainly contributed to death, whether it's the manner in which they arrested him, tasering him, even when he said, I can't breathe, and or his mom, just standing there, just horrified and shaken. What we know is that use of force, police, law enforcement disproportionately use force against Black and brown people. And so part of that is ensuring that we are establishing statewide use of force standards on when it is appropriate and justified to not just use force, but use excessive or even deadly force. We have to be able to set the standard for that. And those standards are particularly important because if an officer were to then violate those standards, what that would mean is the role of the prosecutors would be more clear cut in that here is what we are able to prosecute and to win. And so we have to create standards, use of force standards, with criminal implications if those standards are violated, so that officers who do use excessive or deadly force and are not justified to do so, in the case of Atlanta right now, that there is law that exists on that, and prosecutors will then have direction on what it is that they need to do.
Okay, so when it comes to the use of force standards that are currently in Maryland, is there any particular instances or examples of use of force standards that are current? Is there wait? Are you telling me that there's not a universal use of force standard in Maryland? And is it county by county or district by district, or is it just kind of in the air and kind of vague?
Well, various police departments have use of force policies, so it's not uniform, and as I understand, it's not statewide either. And so this is why it's particularly important for us to establish a statewide use of force standards that police and sheriff's departments and law enforcement are not only trained on or aware of, but understand the implications of using excessive or deadly force when it is not justified.
So, hypothetically, if somebody was killed by police and and held by two different police departments, considering whichever area they're living in currently in Maryland, that case could be held completely differently and to a different standard, all depending on where they're living in Maryland.
Well, various police departments and sheriff departments have use of force policies. So there is a different standard because police and sheriff's departments, police departments in particular, have different use of force policies. And so that's why you see some police chiefs across the country who are taking action to update use of force policies, to change use of force policies, or even some city councils codifying that into city code or county code or state law, which is what we're trying to do in this case. But it is not uniform. And so what we need to ensure is that whether you live in Frederick or whether you live in Anne Arundel County or Montgomery County or Baltimore City, that there is a standard for police and for law enforcement on when it is appropriate and justified to use force. And there must not only be a standard, but there must be accountability if those standards are breached. And so that's why it's important for statewide, because, again, we don't want this patchwork of use of force policies, right? We want to ensure that we have a uniform standard that is applicable to everyone.
I just wanted to go over one last thing with you. Another thing that has to do with policing in Maryland. I brought it up earlier. Mandatory minimums. What is your view of the idea of bringing mandatory minimums to Maryland on the type of cases that Larry Hogan has particularly highlighted?
So I do not support mandatory minimum sentences. There is a body of academic work out there that points to how mandatory minimums not only disproportionately impact Black and brown people, but particularly Black people, because we are overrepresented in the criminal justice system by design and by laws and at times intentionality. And so there's a body of work that points to how this not only ties the hands of judges who really should be making the sentencing decisions and adjudicating over cases based on the facts of the case, the severity of the offense, the individual, and the totality of the circumstances. That is not what mandatory minimums do. Mandatory minimums do not consider the individual situation. It does not consider the individual that is before the judge. It does not consider the circumstance of the individual.
Takes away a judge's discretion?
And, well, yeah, obviously it ties judges' hands, as I mentioned, but mandatory minimums to humanize this issue, because we could talk about mandatory minimums and why it's bad, but ultimately we have to humanize these issues so that people understand, because there are human lives that are being impacted by these laws. So judges make decisions based on the totality of circumstances, right? And the individual and the offense, etc. And so if someone is, let's say, a first-time drug offender with no prior record, and there are mandatory minimums that in essence call for, 5 to 10 years, right? Minimum or maximum, there is no, as you mentioned, discretion for judges because their hands are tied. So a judge that would consider the circumstances of an individual before them who has had to make certain decisions, who have made bad decisions, who have no prior offenses, or clearly is misdirected in certain circumstances where they would have the discretion to be able to say, well, this is clearly someone that needs to go to this program, or perhaps this sentence, etc. They aren't able to do because mandatory minimums, in essence, call for a particular or a specific sentence for a specific offense, and there's no flexibility in that. And so I don't support it. I never have. I think we should be finding ways to ensure that judges not only have discretion, but that we're really dealing with the issue of gun violence, I keep pointing out, because we're talking about police violence here. Police violence is gun violence, right? The police kill over 1,000 people in America just last year, and a majority of those victims were unarmed, right? That is violence. That is gun violence. When we talk about the fact that Black communities are over-policed in America, and the militarization of our police departments, and the routine killings, as we saw, in Chicago with Laquan McDonald, right, or in other places like, Philando Castile and others. All of these are situations of gun violence, and so gun violence and police violence are one and the same. And so if the governor was really interested in addressing gun violence, he would address certainly police violence, because it is interrelated. But I think he's more focused on passing these draconian policies that do not work, as studies time and again have shown, in the hopes that he could get some kind of a political victory. But ultimately, as a society, we are not getting victory by supporting mandatory minimums.
I personally, when it comes to the issue of police violence and our governor, I remember he had a meeting with President Trump and a bunch of other governors, and Trump was, of course, calling for his hard military crackdown on people who are practicing the First Amendment right, and he particularly agreed with Trump, and he said, "I agree with you on everything you just said."
Yeah, and well, not only that, I mean, he also approved the request, even though some governors refused that request, but to send the Maryland National Guard into DC to, in essence, suppress peaceful protesters. And it's shameful because it was all for a photo op. And the fact that we sent National Guard men and women, took them out of, their homes and with their families to go to DC to suppress
And beat
peaceful
up their
protest.
neighbors.
Disgusting. Yeah, it is disgusting. But the reason why Trump could do that, to a much larger point, the reason why Trump could do that is because DC is not a state. And so I'd just like to make a little shameless plug for my House resolution, which I introduced for the second time during the 2020 session, that a House resolution that supports DC statehood. And
Winning my heart over here.
Yeah, and autonomy and respect for Washingtonians. And so I think if DC were a state, obviously the circumstances would have been different, but it makes these situations easier. And for folks like Hogan and Trump to make these decisions because DC is not a state, and it's even more reason why we should support DC statehood.
Would you follow the same principle when it comes to Puerto Rico, Guam, and all the other, in my opinion, colonized territories?
Well, I think the circumstances are a little bit different when we talk about Puerto Rico and even Hawaii and Guam and these other places. The District of Columbia, there's overwhelming support for DC statehood, and there have been many efforts over the years to push for DC statehood. In Puerto Rico, there has been a nationalist movement for Puerto Rico to be its own independent country for a really long time and to break the chains of U.S. colonialism. And there have also been some Puerto Ricans who have been in support of the idea of Puerto Rico becoming a state within the United States. And there have been some really divisive conversations. There have been some deep divides on this issue, whether it's from the older generation or the younger generation, or whether it's from the more nationalist Puerto Ricans or those who see the benefit of being a state, and those that see the benefit of Puerto Rico being its own country. So I don't think the conversation is easier than or as easy as the conversation around DC statehood is. And I think we need to give due respect to the differing opinions around whether Puerto Rico should be a U.S. state or its own country. I think we need to keep in mind that there was a whole Puerto Rican independence movement, and in fact, people who stormed, Puerto Rican nationalists who stormed the United States Congress to push for Puerto Rican independence. And those people are still around, and there are still young people, millennials, our generation and the next, who are supportive of Puerto Rican independence, who want to reject this colonial history that Puerto Rico has. And then you have some folks who are both old and young who support that and have made arguments. There have been many votes on this issue in Puerto Rico and Puerto Rico supporting statehood. There have been a lot of questions around the results of those votes. Like, for instance, the most recent vote that they had around Puerto Rico.
22% turnout, yeah.
Exactly. So there was a really low turnout, and a lot of people were making the arguments about, well, is this really reflective of the populace? So
it was, the results were particularly perplexing because there was a similar referendum in 2012, and it was a lot more balanced up without society. But the 2017 referendum, it was 22% turnout and 97% support of statehood. Now, that's the type of thing you hear, like Kim Jong-un reelected with 99% of the vote. It was quite ridiculous. I mean, it was very obvious that people boycotted the vote.
yeah, I think we need to respect Puerto Ricans, Boricuas, and allow them to not only have this conversation amongst themselves as stakeholders in this conversation. I think there also needs to be some real educating on both sides when making that case, right? And then I think ultimately people should be encouraged to engage in their democracy by voting. Democracy comes from the Greek word demos, meaning the people. And so we have to ensure that we are engaging the people in this process and then having them decide on which way forward and which way is best for Puerto Rico and for them as Puerto Ricans. We should not decide that. The U.S. Congress should not decide that. The people of Puerto Rico should decide that, as is the case, as should be the case with Guam and any other U.S. territories. They should be able to decide whether they want to remain an overseas territory, whether they want to be a U.S. state, or whether they want to be independent. I think it's all about the will of the people.
I believe Guam's last referendum was in 1985, which shows just how long it's been since we've really asked their opinion. There's one last thing I wanted to get to you from internationally, and are you familiar with the organization Amnesty International?
I am, yes.
So they mostly, deal with human rights abuses around the world, and they made a recent comment on how our police have conducted themselves during protests. And I wanted to get your thought on this because I've brought this to a few public officials, and they've all reacted in different ways, and I'm interested in your reaction. So here's the quote. U.S. police across the country are failing their obligations under international law to respect and facilitate the right to peaceful protests, exacerbating a tense situation and endangering the lives of protesters. What do you think of that statement?
I think that statement is accurate. I think the statement doesn't go far enough in really describing what it is that we're seeing right now, not just in terms of attacks on peaceful protesters, but also attacks on journalists. And I think we need to realize that journalists are a big part of our democracy and a big part of strengthening our democracy, because one of the tenets of democracy is freedom of information and freedom of the press. If we aren't aware what it is our government and people in places of power are doing, we are not aware of how their decisions are impacting our lives. And so I think the statement is certainly accurate. The United States has always been the biggest contradiction to violence that we preach abroad. And each and every day, whether it's violence against peaceful protesters or against journalists, or whether it's Black and brown people and indigenous people in this country, the United States has always been exceptional in that regard. And even when we look at things like the use of tear gas, which, as we know, is banned under international law.
Yep, banned under international law, and it ended up killing a protester recently.
Right. And so we are continuing to not just violate our own laws, right, but international law as well. And I think we should all see this as...
I do want to highlight, when it comes to international law, it's specifically banned in warfare. which, while technically what we're doing with it, tear gas isn't illegal, when it comes to using it domestically, it shows that we are not even allowed to use it against our enemies, but we'll use it against our own citizens.
But are we in a war? And who exactly are we fighting against? And what are we fighting against? And the reality of it is we are not in a war. So there is no instance for use of tear gas to be justified. Um, the government is not at war with its citizens. What the government is doing is attempting to suppress um, the rightful calls by oppressed people in this country who are also citizens to dismantle the racist and the corrupt systems that continuously brutalize us with impunity, right? We are not at war. This is not a war zone. This is not a war situation. And this is precisely why when we say things and or do things like use tear gas and our police looking like they're in war zones rather than on American streets, right? That speaks to how the system is attempting to continue to suppress, because this is not the first time. There have been riots across America around police violence that the police and the military have suppressed, right?
Actually goes on to say the same statement. They are equipping officers in a manner more appropriate for a battlefield and may put them in a mindset that confrontation and conflict with protesters are inevitable.
I agree with that as well. So I'm assuming there's more. So what you read for me initially, I thought that was it. But if
Oh
they go
no, it goes
on,
into white supremacy and unlawful
oh,
killings of
good,
black
great.
people. It's
Well, I'm glad they're going even further and they're touching on things like white supremacy. They're touching on things like the militarization of our police departments. They're talking things like the tactics that law enforcement is employing to suppress peaceful protesters. Absolutely right, and I completely join them in those calls because we're seeing it on our streets and we're seeing it every single day. The United States spends more as a country on law enforcement than other countries do on military spending.
I
And
would
we're
just
not
I would
talking about our military budget as yet.
yep.
We're just talking strictly law enforcement.
I will just finish out the statement. Racism and white supremacy are fueling these killings and the police response to the protests. The federal government should set up a national commission to address all aspects of the crisis, including killings by police, the right to protest, and ending discrimination. President Trump must end his violent and discriminatory rhetoric and policies. The U.S. government at all levels must ensure the right to protest as guaranteed by international law.
I would agree with that. I would also call for not just a commission looking into that, but a number of commissions to include a commission to look at and explore reparations to people of African descent in this country. There's so much work that we need to do. We need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We're one of those countries. We're the only country, and here we are again when we talk about American exceptionalism, right? We have never created a Truth and Reconciliation Commission despite institutional and chattel slavery, despite Jim Crow, despite civil rights, despite the police violence, despite the war on drugs, despite the crack epidemic, right? We have never truly created a Truth and Reconciliation to explore America's role in the brutal oppression and continued oppression of Black people in this country, of Indigenous people in this country, of Latinx people in this country. We've never really had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to explore that, and I think we do. So I would agree with that statement, but I would go a little bit further in saying that we should have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but we should also have a commission to explore reparations and what the United States needs to do and what reparations would look like for people of African descent in this country. Ultimately, what we are looking for and what a lot of people keep calling for is for us to be the United States of America. But we cannot have unity without justice, and we can't have justice without truth telling, and we can't have truth telling without uh, 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 honesty, and we can't have honesty without courage. And America does not have the courage to come to terms with its original sin, come to terms with all the race elements of the system that are still in place today. And this is why the idea of a United States of America is still so elusive.
I mean, I hate to bring it back to like foreign policy, but it's my area of expertise. Recently, when we're talking about the Trump administration is going to be sanctioning individuals from the International Criminal Court who are looking into abuses and war crimes that our troops committed in Afghanistan. Bill Clinton refused to apologize for the crimes we committed at No Gun Re in South Korea. I mean, of course, we can look back to how Bush, H.W. Bush, didn't apologize for the shooting down of Iranian planes. If we recognize the truth of many of our actions, couldn't that threaten the power base of these very powerful individuals?
I'm sorry. Say that again. What's the question?
Wouldn't the recognition of this truth telling threaten their power base? Wouldn't that be the thing they are fearing? I mean, if we acknowledge No Gun Re, the shooting down of Iranian planes, or the fact that the ICC is currently investigating our troops for crimes in Afghanistan, and we're going to sanction them over it.
I'm sorry. I'm confused.
What I'm getting at is that this is not only something that we have done to our own citizens, but this is an international issue of our conduct and inability to.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Whether it's the United States seeing itself and previous presidents seeing their role as being the police of the world, and we see how that has gotten us. But we are the biggest contradiction on the international stage when it comes to violence and human rights. And this is why we see dictators, and I'm in no way supporting dictators like Kim Jong un and others, but we've seen how dictators have pointed out that contradiction to the United States, to leaders of the United States, as well as the government, when we criticize North Korea, we criticize Saudi Arabia and these other countries for all these human rights violations. When we commit human rights violations right here in the United States, police violence and the extrajudicial killings of Black men, women, and children is a human rights issue. Folks may not be aware, but I talk about this in my op-ed, When Pain is the Prerequisite for Progress. In there, I mentioned that Paul Robeson and the Civil Rights Congress presented a document titled We Charge Genocide in 1951 to the United Nations. And that document, which I suggest everyone familiarize themselves with, in essence was Black Americans detailing instances of police brutality and police violence to point out the human rights violations in this country. And that was part of a tactic and a strategy, taking it to the United Nations as an international body and an international organization that promotes human rights, right? Here is a violation of human rights in what is supposed to be the beacon of democracy in the world. And although Black people are really the people who have made the United States the democracy that it is today, we continue to not see the fruits or share in the benefits of this democratic society.
I appreciate you taking time to talk to me today. I know you're an extremely busy man with everything that's going on. I just want to say that when I was first getting into Maryland politics, you're somebody I look to personally as an inspiration. Even though you're not even from my county, I live in Prince George's, gorgeous Prince George's. So,
We like Prince George's County too.
hey, thank you. I appreciate that. I hope you have a wonderful day. And is there anything you'd like to shout out? Any charities? Your re-election campaign? Anything you would like to highlight?
I would just ask that folks continue to show up in their state capitals, but especially show up in Annapolis around this issue, and make sure that we're demanding of our state representatives that they take action on police violence, and that we pass Anton's Law and we repeal the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. That needs to be a constant demand until it happens. And everyone needs to, all of us who are outraged by this, all of us now need to channel that anger into a purpose, and that purpose should be the passage of comprehensive legislation. That is Anton's Law, repealing the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, as well as a number of other things.
Thank you, and you. I just want to tell you solidarity, and have a wonderful evening.
You too. Take care.
Can't feel presence of Lord, and I'm done. Oh shit.
What's his name?
Anton Black!
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 No justice,
No peace! No justice, no peace!
Anton Black!
Anton Black!